Welcome to Rethink You, bringing you ideas, inspiration, and motivation to start living the life you were created to live. Here is your host, author, trainer, speaker, and coach, and founder of Rethink You, Kim Lovings.
Well, hello, and welcome back to the Rethink You podcast. I hope you've enjoyed the speakers we've had on the podcast recently. And for those of you who are attending the Think Health Summit in May, I look forward to seeing you and seeing your response because you've heard from several speakers. This month, we are promoting another set of speakers, and this is ahead of a panel that I plan to do in June around strategies that are successfully helping prevent and heal mental health challenges amongst those who protect and serve, which includes our first responders and those in the armed forces, etc. So stand by for information on that. So today I'm delighted to introduce you to Joe Smarro, who is the CEO of SolutionPoint Plus. Joe and I met a while ago, and I'm just blessed to call him a friend because, you know, Joe is a decorated combat vet from the US Marine Corps. He honorably served 2 tours to Afghanistan and Iraq with the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines. Once Joe's Marine Corps enlisted ended, he moved to South Texas, where he joined the San Antonio Police Department in 2005. And as you'll hear from many of our vets, this is a common transition. When they come back home, they end up going into law enforcement. But after working 4 years on patrol, Joe was one of the original members of the mental health unit of the San Antonio Police Department. Joe helped grow their mental health unit into a nationally recognized best practice policing unit identified under the Obama administration. Joe's been featured in multiple media outlets, and he provided a TEDx talk in 2018 titled, "I See You." I remember watching that before I ever met Joe, and trust me, go and search for it. It is powerful. And it was also the main subject in an award-winning HBO documentary titled Ernie Joe, Crisis Cops. Joe earned a Hector Geiser Award for being the top graduate at Wayland Baptist University, where he earned his bachelor's degree. And following college, he also went to Texas A&M, University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and earned a certificate in veterans entrepreneurship. Joe is the founder and CEO, as I said, of SolutionPoint Plus, which you can find in the show notes. We'll give you the link. And this is a national training and consulting firm that focuses on cultivating mental wellness to maximize human capital and promote safety within organizations. So that's one heck of a bio, Joe, but I know the person behind that. I know some of your stories, and I look forward to this conversation today so very much because the work that you do is so incredibly powerful. So thank you so much for being here. And why don't you start by telling us, first of all, perhaps what made you decide to go into the Marine Corps? Let's go back to the beginning of the story.
Hey, Kim, thank you so much for having me. The last time I heard an introduction that beautifully articulated, it was from Tom Bilyeu, who is, that's an incredible compliment to you. And while you were talking, something came to mind, something that you taught me in one of our early conversations. And so I hope you're ready for this, but Saubana, Kim, Saubana, right? Something like that. It's she taught me some South African.
Saubana, Joe. Yes. Saubana.
So, so why did I join the Marine Corps? Well, I was, people have heard that USMC stands for Uncle Sam's Misguided Children. And I was definitely one of them. So I had a very rough upbringing, like a lot of people that join the military do. And because I had my first child, my senior year of high school, it at least made me feel limited in my fear-based mindset and uncertainty. And, I wanted to go to college and play soccer. That's what I had my mind set on. But again, I wasn't living at home. My girlfriend's parents took me in. When I ended up leaving home at 15, they took me in when I was 16, early 17. And because I didn't have a job, I tell people the only way I knew how to thank them was by getting their daughter pregnant. And I say that with a smile because it's incredibly inappropriate. And we're all still very close to this day, but I'm terrible. So no, I mean, I made poor choices, and I love my daughter. She'll be 22 this year, but it's unbelievable to me how when I reflect on life, to think of some of the worst, choices that I made or felt like I didn't have a choice, ended up being an incredible blessing. And I think there's a huge lesson in that for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Joe. Because so many times life lessons we only see the lesson and the takeaway much later in life. So I'm so pleased for that. So talk to us about your transition then into the Marines and how you ended up going into combat. But perhaps more importantly, instead of this just being a biographical story, perhaps you could talk about some of the lessons that you learned during your time in combat that have served you well later on.
Yeah, Kim, I think one of the most important lessons that I share with people about my time, one, joining the Marine Corps, but two, what happened is, again, it's a classic example. If I knew what was going to happen in my military career, I would have absolutely avoided ever doing it. I had a fantastic recruiter that did an incredible job of lying to me. And I'm grateful that he did, because if he were to tell me, hey, look, I can promise you that over the next 4 years, you're going to spend more time out of country in the Middle East than you will back in the States. I can promise you that you're going to be exposed to some of the worst sides of humanity. I know for certain I wouldn't have had the courage to agree to do that. I know for sure, especially as an 18-year-old kid, I would have said absolutely not. But because he told me I would be guaranteed to be stationed in the Northeast and I would never deploy and I could have a nice cush office job, I thought, well, this doesn't sound so bad at all. It just sounds like a job. And they promised to take care of my daughter. And they did. It was very easy for me to sign up because, again, what else was I going to do is what I thought. And so I signed up and, I go to boot camp, and right away I was overwhelmed, just culture shock, screaming and yelling. I was like, oh my goodness, what did I do? And, what wasn't known at that time, because I joined in 2000, was that the events of 9/11 were going to unfold a short time later. And so once 9/11 happened, that obviously changed the whole course of my enlistment. And right after 9/11, they deployed us to Afghanistan. And I was over there for several, maybe 9 months in Afghanistan, doing different operations. And then when we came back, you know, as soon as we got back to the States, they were like, okay, we're going to start training now because we're going back to combat. Well, we thought we just left combat, and it wasn't super eventful. I mean, almost nothing happened. And so we were like kind of lackadaisical in our approach, thinking like, what's the big deal? And then when we go over in 2003, we actually got to Kuwait in January. And those were three of the most psychologically, I would say, harming or traumatic months of my life, because there was so much back and forth and up and down. You'd have a general come in on a Tuesday and say, all right, Marines, pack up. We're leaving Thursday. We're going home. And then on Thursday morning, you think you're leaving, going back home. And then it's like, nope, unpack. We're settling in. We're going to war tomorrow. And we're like, and this happened more than a dozen times over that course of 3 months. And then we know the war started March 19th, 2003. And so I remember vividly that night before when they said, we're going tomorrow. And we were like, yeah, okay, we've heard this 15 times already. We just didn't take it serious. And President Bush gave the green light and we ended up leaving. And I learned a lot of lessons in that first 72 hours. Some of the worst experiences that I had to deal with, as a young Marine who had never been exposed to something like that, was absolutely fully equipped and trained. But psychologically, you can't prepare for something like that. The level of traumatic exposure of being in firefights, of having to deal with seeing, someone's life be taken, to see dead children, to see like also just how, um, you know, how like disposable that we are as enlisted Marines. One of the first experiences where I had this aha moment was we were in these like we were in Amtrak vehicles, which are heavily armored track vehicles. And as soon as we were approaching this firefight, they had all of us get out and put us into softback Humvees. And I was like, why is this? And they're like, oh, because we're putting all the officers in the Amtraks to protect them, but we're going to put the enlisted in the in the Humvees as we're going to drive through this first village where there's an active firefight happening. And so right there, and this was probably within the first 8 hours of crossing the border. And so right away it was like, oh, like we are clearly very disposable out here, and it's just part of it, right? And so it was a very scary time that I felt equipped and prepared for. Tactically I was prepared, but mentally it was a whole different environment. And again, something that years later I could look back on and appreciate, one, that I survived it, but also the life lessons that I gained from that, which was how fleeting life is, like how quickly it can be taken from us, how much we really don't understand. Because in meeting some of the children over in Iraq and some of the people, to realize that they're no different than us. They're just people who want all the same things. They want safety, they want security, they want love. And yet here we are completely at war with one another, and over what, and so it was very hard to fully understand in that moment.
Wow, that is powerful, Joe. And thank you for sharing that, because it kind of reminds me what I said to somebody recently. You can tell me if you agree or disagree. I don't mind being controversial on my podcast. But I said, obviously I'm South African and moving to the States. So a lot of the military and the experiences you talk about are new to me, even though our men went to different wars. We just had a different lingo, a different approach. But here in America, it's a common thing to thank people for their service. But I said somebody recently, it often feels very disingenuous to me when you say, oh, thank you for your service. You have no idea what this person went through. Somehow just saying, oh, thank you for your service doesn't sound sincere to me. So what is your response as a veteran when people say thank you for your service in the way that I mentioned, where it's almost sort of an afterthought and flippant, it's not heartfelt? Am I right to be offended on your behalf? Where do you stand with that? Because that small little example you gave us is an illustration of a world that people like me just have never seen or been exposed to.
Yeah, Kim, I think it's incredible insight that you have, because I'm actually aligned with you, and it's not super popular. There are some people who crave that and it means something to them. But I think it's so individual specific, because I'm more with you. When people say it, I almost get uncomfortable, because to me, I want to know, like, well, what does that mean to you? Because again, it's so sad to me that, there's so many young people, men and women, that go into the military, and they're, forgive the term, but they're essentially brainwashed into this idea that, what we're about to do is so vitally important to the success or the freedoms of our country. And that, when you put it in perspective, once you're removed from it, you realize that you're thousands and thousands of miles away in someone else's land, someone else's territory, and you're fighting for the flag, the freedoms, all these like symbols. And then you come home, and it's like incredibly difficult at times to get access to care after the fact, to process or transition into what is a civilian life. And so when you have someone saying just this blanket, thank you for your service, it's like there's such a disparity between, military members in each branch, within each branch, whether you're a Marine or an enlisted member or an officer that never left, and you did 20 years, but you never left the United States and were safe the entire time, yeah, thank you for your service, because it's a job. But then for those that had to, get thrusted into or forced into situations that maybe they didn't even understand or agree with, except for, I'm on this side, you're on that side, you want to kill me, I want to defend my brother and sister, and I don't want to die. And so now we're in the middle of this like warfare where it's just survival. It has nothing to do with values and principles and ideas and theory. And it's just, look, you're trying to kill me and I don't want to die, and so I'm going to defend myself. But really, when we look at it from a global lens, like, what is actually happening? Like, why are we actually doing this? And I think for a lot of people, we never really get that answer, because you just come home, you turn in your weapon at the armory, and if your term's up, you get out, and then you're looking for a job, and it's like, well, what skills do I have? How does this translate into working in corporate America, where I find myself wanting to avoid everything because I don't want to really process the feeling that I'm having, which is confusion or frustration or anger. And so I keep my circle very small. And when you have someone just say like, "Oh, thank you for your service," my response to that has always been, "What does that even mean? Like, why are you saying that? Like I'm happy to have a conversation, but what are you actually thanking me for?" And if you're saying, "Well, I'm thanking you because I know I have the liberties and the freedoms because you went and did that," I'm thinking, I think if we didn't go and do that, you would still have the same liberties and freedoms, but it's all part of this like story we have. So I don't, and again, this isn't like an anti-military at all stance. I just think it begs for a deeper conversation. And I think that there's a lot of confusion out there from people who have not been in the military of what it means, what it looks like, what it demands of the men and women who make that choice. Because
Right.
even for me, while if I knew everything that would have happened, I wouldn't have chosen it. At the end of the day, it is a choice, right? And so I think that if anything, we can honor the fact that there are certain people, because it's such a small population, right? Less than 1%, I think, of America joins the military or is a veteran, and so it's such a small fraction. And so if anything, it's like, hey, thank you for volunteering to do that service. But I don't know. I've always been uncomfortable with that as well, Kim, and I agree with you. It's because it just leaves so much open to interpretation. And what I have learned myself is the people who have done the most, and when I say done the most, I mean has the most tours, the most exposure, the most trauma, they want to avoid that the most. They want to avoid the thank you for the service, your service the most. The ones who have never been able to deploy or do anything, they almost like welcome that in moreover, or more so than the ones who have I guess had a more active enlistment. So I don't know. It's a weird thing for sure that I don't have figured out.
Right. Well, thank you so much for going there with me, because I think it was interesting that we unpacked that, and
Yeah.
I think that's an insight that hopefully people will learn from. That that the more experienced and the more trauma, the less they like that kind of recognition. And that said, I also know, and you and I both go down this path of neuroscience and the physiology of the brain, and we know the impact that this kind of trauma can have on your brain. And Joe, I was really struck by what you said about that insecurity, that constantly changing. I know the effect that that can have on the brain, because if you're sort of gearing up, you're going home, so that's one transition, and then they change it on you. So it builds this pattern within the brain that's not healthy. So I think that everybody can acknowledge that there are behavioral health impact for anyone who's been in combat. But I want to sort of change direction slightly and say, acknowledging that, I also know, and I know people make fun of me, but I watch a lot of military shows and I know they're fiction. And now I'm getting to know real SEALs, so I can actually ask them about the SEAL team that I watch on TV. But having watched that and Six on the History Channel and some of the others, I like to feel I've gained a little insight into some of the challenges. And talk to me a little about the challenge you personally faced coming out of the military. As you said, now you sort of hit normal life, and your brain's been programmed in a certain way, and depending how many tours you've done and how many times you've been in combat, the more entrenched those patterns in the brain. Talk to me about your personal journey of readjustment to the free world, this side, stateside.
Yeah. So for me, I because after that second tour to Iraq, I got out just a few months later, and not only did I get out, I'm from New York originally. I was stationed in California. I was deployed more than I was home, and then once I got out, I moved to South Texas, a place I had never been, and so it was all very new for me. And the only person I knew was Jesse, who's my best friend and business partner now, and he's from South Texas, and so it was his idea of like, hey, let's go there. And so that, but once I got here, it was like, well, now what, And so naturally, because of my limited, I had no education at that time. I was 22 years old. And again, a very specific skill set that doesn't necessarily translate into a corporate job. And so for me, I found myself applying for the police department. It was just like you mentioned in the opening, it's a very natural transition for so many people out of, I think, scarcity, or out of like just a lack of having more opportunities unless you had a very specific job within the military that then translates. Uh, but but what I found super interesting too is because once I joined the police department, it wasn't a cure-all. In fact, it probably exacerbated some of my issues from the military and from my deployment. And it took me about 6 years, almost 7 years of being a police officer and being in a very dark space. And, on my second divorce and, really finding myself struggling. And it was as my wife was leaving me, telling me, like, hey, there's something seriously wrong with you. Like, you really need to go talk to someone and get help. And of course, I challenged that. But I did because I, lost another kid to a divorce. And then now I'm looking at having three kids that I don't raise because I just keep losing them because I'm making terrible choices and high risk behaviors. And it wasn't that I always knew right from wrong, but I had a complete apathy towards life and consequences. And even as a police officer, and now that I'm no longer with the police department, I found myself, and I started going to therapy, and I was telling my therapist, like, I go a lot of shifts where I don't even carry my firearm. And I know that's reckless. And it's not because I did struggle with suicidal ideations, but it was more easier and more acceptable for me to put myself in positions where, well, if it happens, then so be it. And I almost welcomed it. And and it was because I was so tired of feeling pain. I was so tired of dealing with the fact that I just kept messing up life. And when I finally got into the VA, and I was, they were doing the whole psychosocial background and finding out my story. And they told me, like, Joe, with your childhood trauma, because at 7 years old, I had extensive sexual abuse and molestation. And then that quickly translated into physical abuse. And then, child custody, court battles, and parental discord and divorce. And then, my dad got custody, but then there was several relationships after where all of those were toxic. And I was physically abused in all of those. And so I ended up leaving home at a very early age and kind of running away and couch surfing with friends. But they told me at the first appointment at the VA that what they had discovered was that people with childhood trauma, especially significant childhood trauma, were at 300 times greater risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder in combat because of that trauma. And so I almost found myself frustrated and thought, well, shouldn't the military have some like vetting practices? And maybe I should have never even been allowed to go in. I'm not just a willing, warm body, but maybe if I had these experiences growing up and you knew that it was possible that I would be exposed to combat, maybe it's best that I never go in the first place. But again, perspective, hindsight is I'm glad I got that experience because as much as I hated being in combat in the moment, I'm very appreciative, sadly, of the credibility it gives me in the profession that I have now. Same thing with the police department. My therapist said, Joe, this is the worst job you could have chosen, right? Becoming a cop after having combat exposure is the worst job you could get into from a therapist standpoint, because all you're doing is you're perpetuating that traumatic exposure. And just as we start to heal or process previous traumatic events, you're just reintroducing new ones. And because my first year as a police officer, I had an in custody death where I fought with a guy for 7 minutes. He had a warrant. He resisted. He fought with me. I never took anything off my gun belt. Didn't tase him, didn't pepper spray him, nothing. Just fought for 7.5 minutes before cover showed up, and he died in my arms. And because of that, I was so frustrated and thinking, like, I got out of the military because I didn't want to be around death anymore. And now here I am, this guy, like, and again, I'm so fortunate. It was a terrible situation, but I'm so glad it happened back in 2006, because if it were today, I mean, I would have been slung out to dry, hung over the news and everything else, because, it's just the climate that we're in. And so it's just, I'm really, as I do a lot of self-reflection, Kim, as we've talked about, and I'm very grateful of the things that have happened in my life, as difficult as they've been, but of my will, because for me, we all have a choice, and I choose to find the lesson in everything, or I believe that life will continue to present the opportunity until you fully learn the lesson. And so that was my transition into the police department. It was really out of necessity, scarcity. And then once I got on the mental health unit, it really did save my life. But I'll kind of tee up a question here if you have it. But what I share is, the first 2.5 years to 3 years that I was on the mental health unit, I was a total hypocrite. I was a total hypocrite. And I was telling people every single day, if you would just go to the doctor, if you would just take your medication, if you would just do what you're supposed to do, you wouldn't have to deal with the police. Like if you would just do X, Y, and Z. And then I was leaving work, going home, depressed out of my mind, completely unhappy, unhealthy, drinking a 6-pack every day just to fall asleep, not taking my own advice, not in treatment, not in therapy. And I'm like, no wonder they don't want to listen to me. Right. And it's in, and so, well, we can revisit this because there's more to it. But one of the biggest breakthroughs I ever had in my own personal journey was when I started going to therapy myself. And I started to realize that I could see myself just as everyone else that I'm dealing with. And by the grace of God, that I get to be on this side of the 911 call and not the one having the police respond to my house. And so it was an incredible lesson for me once I realized that I'm just as broken as everyone else out there, but I'm finally willing to own that and show it to other people.
Oh, Joe, that's powerful. I almost don't want to interrupt you because I know that you have just given such a huge part of yourself in this discussion, which is why I'm not peppering you with questions. But I think that that's an important fact that you mentioned. There's a couple of things in there, but the one I wanted to draw out was the fact that the credibility of those who are taking care of people who need help, you need to be walking the walk and talking the talk, which I know you and Jesse definitely do. But to go back a little, how did you end up getting into the behavioral health unit, considering by your own admission what a mess you were? Why do you think they selected you to go work in that division?
Yeah, well, forgive me in advance for being incredibly offensive, but what we know is that most people who are drawn to this field have their own personal story of struggles, right? And so we become very curious. It's like a journey of self-discovery, which I think we're all on, but some people spend a lot of time avoiding it. But I think we all eventually get there. People who go into, clinical settings or psychiatry, psychologists, clinicians, I think we all have on some level, and not everybody, but I think most people are drawn to this field because they want to figure out what happened to me as a kid and why do I feel the way I feel. And so we professionally pursue that. For me personally, what I knew was I there was a really strong thing that happened in my profession as a patrol officer. And it was about 2.5 years in. And I remember, I was working patrol on the south side of San Antonio. It's overnight. I pull over this car for a traffic violation. The guy gets out and he runs on foot. Not super uncommon. And I remember chasing him and I'm keying up on the radio saying, "Hey, I've got one running. This is the direction of flight. This is what he's wearing." Nobody can outrun a police radio, right? So I already know what's going to happen now. Everyone's going to start coming to the area. And I'm telling the guy as I'm chasing him, I said, "Hey man, this is not going to be good for you." And I never really got too excited. Again, thankfully, because of my Marine Corps experience, I never really got caught up too much. Whereas people who didn't have those experiences, they took this very serious. They took it personal almost, and it almost became more dangerous than it needed to be. I was always very lighthearted in these situations. And I'd say, "Hey man, you probably should stop, like, because people are going to come, they're going to catch you and it's not going to be good for you. Like, just surrender, man. And it can be much easier. Like, let me just walk you to the car." And this is like in a full sprint. And I'm also trying to emotionally regulate myself, right? So I remember we ended up catching him, and it's again back in the day before all the body cameras and the climate that we live under right now. But this is part of the training in police academies too. Is like, hey, if someone runs from you, you need to educate them to not do this anymore. Which usually meant maybe use a little bit of extra force or drop an elbow or drop a knee on them or something just to be like, you shouldn't do this. And I remember once we got him secured, handcuffed or whatever, and I'm putting him in my car and I'm driving him to jail, I had this like aha moment of, who have I become that we just, like, as grown men and women, we were high-fiving and celebrating the fact that we essentially just like hunted another human. Like, how different is this than hunting? And I remember driving to jail and it was almost like my balloon was deflated and I no longer bought the BS that the police department told me to believe. And the BS is my belief system. And I fully I didn't just drink the Kool-Aid, Kim, but I like chewed on the ice chips as well from the police academy of, I'm very honest about it. I graduated paranoid. I was afraid. I was terrified thinking that someone in the community was going to shoot me in the head or ambush me when I'm sitting at a Denny's or, want to take my life just because of the uniform I wear. And that moment flipped it for me where I was like, wait a minute, I've yet to like truly have someone want to kill me. If anything, they're trying to get away from me. And so why am I so on edge every day? Why am I so afraid every shift? Why am I terrified every call? And how much of a barrier is this for me to truly try and help people, which isn't this why we're doing this in the first place? And so right away I had this switch flip for me. The mental health unit didn't exist at that time, but I went through the 40-hour crisis intervention team training and I was like, this speaks to me. This is now we're talking about getting down on someone's level, communicating with them, kind of meeting them where they are. And then once the unit started in 2008, it was like, yes, I need this. And so in 2009, well, it started December 2008, became a pilot project for 6 months. In 2009, when it became a unit, I applied and I got in and I never looked back. My goal was to be a lifer in law enforcement and finish my career, but not to promote. I didn't want to leave the unit. And so I gave up the idea of promoting. I gave up promotions. I gave up anything else because for me, it was quality of life. And the mental health unit spoke to me because, again, that was my story. And I got to help people. And I saw so much of myself in all of these situations, whether it was veterans, whether it was just, normal citizens in San Antonio that were suffering on some level. I was like, me too, me too. But it took me a couple of years to realize of what a hypocrite I was and that I was giving people this advice day in and day out that I wasn't taking myself. But I knew before I knew. I knew there was something wrong with me. I knew that I wasn't happy. I knew I was really, really depressed. But this has been a problem that I had faced since probably 7 years old. And in high school, my nickname was Smiley. And yet my first suicidal thought was at 15 years old. But I had this reputation for being incredibly like jovial, happy, outgoing guy, but it was all a facade. It was all a mask. And I could show up at anything and smile and like, yeah, everything's great. And then just like cry my eyes out driving home or just lay in bed so depressed and sad about everything in life. And so it finally was that second divorce that really kind of like broke me open to where I was like, I need something. And it was still a journey. Just because I started going didn't fix everything. I ended up getting a third divorce and I, ended up with, now I have 4 children from 3 different relationships. And, I would say that I started my journey through therapy. I was probably 29 years old, 28, 29 years old. And now I'm 39. And so, but I still go. It's still an important part of my life. It'll always be a part of my life. And that was what the whole point of that TEDx talk was, everybody should have a therapist. I'll end with this, Kim, but Dr. Susan David has this quote that I love. And she says, the price of admission for a life well lived is suffering. And so what that means to me is like, if you're going to do anything in this life, if you're going to achieve or accomplish anything, it's going to take work and there's going to be setbacks. But even if not, the only guarantee we have if we're chosen to live in this world is that it will end. Like we're all going to die. And so people that are close to us die, and that's sad. Animals die. We lose jobs. We lose money. We have hardships. And so the price of admission for a life is suffering. And if we don't know how to process that or deal with that, and most don't, they take it out on their spouses, their kids, their friends, their coworkers, because they don't know how to process all those hardships. And so for me, I think we should all be issued a therapist on our 18th birthday.
Well, I would add to that, except I would say everybody needs a coach, right? Sometimes
100%.
they need a coach and a therapist. But Joe, thank you so much. And yeah, we're not done yet. So I hope you have a few more minutes because I wanted to talk specifically to a couple of issues that you've addressed. I think that it's so true what you said, that you had to go through these experiences, but also those aha moments when you were able to flip the switch on yourself came as a result of getting the help that you need. So I think that's one of the key messages that we're starting to speak out there around this, and that people need to ask for help, but also those around them, because sometimes the person who's in trouble won't ask for help, but somebody close to them knows how to help them. So if you had to give advice to somebody, let's say a spouse or a sibling of somebody who they know is suffering from behavioral health issues and they're in denial and they're just living with this yo-yo, what advice do you have? I mean, is there anything they can do? How do they actually be with that person in a responsible way?
Yeah, I think, and I've recently realized this. I would say probably at the latter part of last year, but the most, as you can tell from this episode, I struggle with being succinct in my responses. But I have created a very short response and how we can best address this. And the simplest thing I've realized is show me, don't tell me. And so one of the best things we can do for people is don't just show me what the resource, or don't just tell me what the resource is. Don't just hand me a phone number to call. Don't just, tell me about what resources are out there or available. Show me how to access them. Show me how to get there. Like it's almost like we have to, and it's not, I'm not being offensive this time, but we almost have to treat people in crisis like children, in the sense that they're not fully operational, right? They're not performing at an optimal level. And I learned this with dealing with first responders. I had it broke my heart. And this was just a month ago, but this is a 53-year-old man who's been a police officer for 16 years, who did 23 years in the Air Force. He's very qualified, but he told me, he said, "Joe, I don't know how to ask for help." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I don't know. Like you can give me the phone number, but I just don't know. Like, and I can call the person, I can make the appointment, but I don't know how to ask for help." And it broke my heart because I'm thinking like, well, first of all, acknowledge that you just did, because you talking to me about this is you asking for help. But second, what I heard him saying was, I don't know how to say the words of "I need help." Moreover, what he's saying is, I am so terrified of what that would either mean about me or the judgment or opinion of someone else if they knew I needed help, that it prevents me from ever doing it in the first place. And so what I told him is, look, I will call for you and make the appointment if you want. I will handhold literally and get you to the appointment if you want. And I'll even sit in on the first appointment and talk to the therapist, and you can just listen. And I'll talk freely about what I know of you. I'll talk about experiences I've had and just kind of demonstrate for you of this is safe. It's okay. And this is what, Jesse and I both have realized of why, um, people are so drawn to our training that we provide, is because of the way we're able to infuse our own personal story from our journey into the actual training content of what we're teaching. But they're so drawn to the story. And I've had people come up to me after and say, "Joe, how did you just stand up in front of a room of 40 or 50 people or whatever's in there? Like, how did you just stand up in front of this room and tell people your story? Like, tell them about the abuse. Like, how did you do that?" And I said, "Well, because someone needs to hear it." And he's like, "Man, I don't like, I could never do that." And I said, "Well, yes, you could, because I used to think I would that same thing, that I would never do that. And now it's what I do for a living, right? This is my full-time gig where I get paid to go around and share my story and obviously put it to a point. But, you know, Jesse and I have both realized that the power of sharing your story and being truly authentic and vulnerable and realizing how that connects people. Don't just tell, this is, and this is for the corporate world too, because I don't know who all your listeners are, Kim, but corporate world, who they feel very good about offering an EAP. People aren't using your EAP. And if you're going to say, no, no, they are, not everyone that needs help is. I promise you. It's not just about providing a resource. It's about bridging that gap between where I am and where I would like to be. But don't just point to the sign saying that all you have to do is go up here and take a right. I need you to walk with me. I need you to demonstrate with me and show me that you can do this, or that you're willing to do this. And finally, to put it in a practical sense, we teach a class on voluntary compliance. I made it 11 years in the police department without having one use of force, 100% voluntary compliance. How did I get that? Well, because I'm not just telling people what to do. I'm in a position of authority. I'm in charge, and I'm going to order people to do something. It's not going to work. The natural tendency is to resist that. The natural tendency is, I'm going to push back on you, especially if you're doing it with like a disrespectful tone. And so how can I get voluntary compliance? I don't tell them to do anything. I ask them to join me in doing what it is that I want them to do. And I'm asked, like, it's such a simple shift. But instead of ordering or making commands, simply invite them to join you in what it is you're wanting to change, and they're far more likely to do it. And it's such a simple thing, but what I've realized is that so few people actually know of it.
Excellent. Excellent. I think that's so wonderful because people don't know how to respond. And even our earlier discussion about saying thank you for your service, I can imagine some listeners saying, well, what are we supposed to do? What do we need to say? It's like, recognize that somebody made a choice to go into action and do this for us, and respect them like you would any other person, because you haven't walked in their shoes. So you don't know what they've gone through. So, and unless you're willing to actually, you're saying, unless you're willing to say, I see you, and actually ask a question to understand, listen to understand, that's the way to engage. But I really appreciate these tips on how to help people. And as I said, I've seen your movies, I've listened to your talks. I'm a fan of the Joe and Jesse movement. So everything you're saying, I'm like, yeah, I saw that. I love that. I love in particular, which we were speaking about earlier with Jesse too, the use of role play and behavioral training. So talk to us a little about what SolutionPoint Plus is doing now and how you're impacting people. And it's one last thing I'll say is when you said about don't point, show me. All my years of retail, I used to always say that's a customer service agent. And it happened to me just this week at Home Depot. Don't tell me the rebar's on aisle 21 on the left. Take me over there. I'm not quite sure what I'm looking for. So you're so right. Everything in how we serve humanity is don't tell me, show me. So thank you for that reminder. But yeah, now let's get back to SolutionPoint Plus. Tell us about the kind of work you're doing and what impact you're having, which I know is amazing. So this is your time to shamelessly plug your company and what you do.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Kim. So this has been a fascinating thing as well. So it started in 2017 as just a side business while Jesse and I were both with the police department. And I'm 100% transparent in saying that as a side business, our whole function was just to make some side money. We knew there was a need. I had been told for probably 2 years from people from around the country that were coming to San Antonio to do what they would call a tour. And they would look at our behavioral health treatment facilities. They would look at our homeless transformational center, and then maybe observe some of our CIT training. But I would represent the police department because we had like all the stakeholders from the community that would come in. And I've had city council members, judges, police chiefs, sheriffs come up to me, just all different people that didn't know each other, and say, man, Joe, you should really think about starting a little side business, just doing some consultation, because you're very passionate about this. You clearly get it, and you're in a market that you've helped create. And so you have some great insights. And I immediately, out of fear, was like, yeah, right. Like, start a business. Like, I know nothing about that, right? Like, I'm a Marine cop, kind of a rock. There's no way I could do this. And so I went to school, and that gave me a huge boost in confidence. But once Jesse and I started this, it really was just like, yeah, let's just go help out people as they need it. We'll make a little money. Again, flip the switch, change perspective. We left our job last year at the end of 2020, pre-retirement. Neither one of us, I had 15 years in, Jesse had 10 years in. We didn't get a pension. We weren't vested. We didn't get benefits, like nothing. And nobody, I mean, maybe one out of every 300 people in our department do that. It's so rare. And so everyone thought we were ridiculous. They were like, you guys are out of your mind. Why would you ever leave? Especially you, Joe, you have 5 years left to get a pension. Like, why would you leave? And it's because I 100% believe in what we're doing. And we shifted our priority from making money to truly serving and building a community. And so SolutionPoint Plus, and then the other thing was, I used to be able to remain humble and be like, oh, this is just the service we offer. Now, because this is full time, I absolutely am shameless. And I tell people, I would put our training in what me and Jesse do as far as mental health, de-escalation, effective communication, gaining voluntary compliance, and especially with first responders, and how we can make them more whole so that they're better equipped to show up and do this. There is no better company in the country, and there's not two better people that are suited for doing this, because we do have the credibility because we both have owned our own story. We're both diagnosed with a mental illness. So we're not going to perpetuate any stigma. We're going to work hard to destigmatize the, the stereotypes that exist in the mental health community. And we just genuinely want what's best for people. One of the things that makes our training so unique is, this is common in the military and in law enforcement, is most trainings are, we're going to better equip you to deal with the community, right? They say, hey, this is just another tool for your tool belt, and it's going to make you better for the community. You're going to get to better serve the community. And I don't love that, because again, someone who's been in that world for so long, it's like, at what point does it get to be about me? And because being selfish has such a bad reputation, what we know is that self-care demands that we're selfish. And so all of our training at Solution Point Plus is individual focus first. Because what we believe is, if we can make you more self-aware, more emotionally intelligent, more cognizant of what's happening in you, and start to like kind of like peel off that mask a little bit and realize that you're not that different than the people that you're quote unquote serving in the community, but really fearing, you can start to really normalize and, I guess, level the playing field. But what we believe is that when we focus on individual self-care, you're going to create a more whole officer who will then have a better family, ideally, because we talk a lot about relationships and just those own personal struggles as well. And then you have a better family dynamic, stability at home. Now you're going to have a better police department. There's more synergy, there's more continuity. Now the police department is actually more effective. And now you're going to have a better relationship with the community. But most trainings right now are, we're going to make you better serve your community. And there's a huge gap. And we just continue to neglect ourselves, which is why the suicide numbers are through the roof, right? We kill ourselves 4-1 versus being killed in the line of duty. That's a problem. And we're not doing enough to talk about it. And so, in 2019, we had 239 suicides versus 44 officers shot and killed in the line of duty. So the fact that we're killing ourselves at that rate, why are we not doing more to talk about this? And so that's the why. Our why drives everything we do right now. I promise you, we don't worry about the money. The money just keeps. And the other weird thing too, for business, for entrepreneurs out there, the moment we stopped truly worrying about money, money just started finding us. I mean, it was like more than we both, I mean, my background a little bit now, but Jesse and I both are like, we have more money in our bank accounts than we've ever had. Why? Because it wasn't the focus anymore. We truly don't worry about that. It really is about growing a community. So we do the full-on 40-hour CIT training. We have a 24-hour crisis de-escalation for non-first responders. That's for community members, treatment providers, schools, hospitals. We do it for all those groups. And then we have a 16-hour, what we call, you'll appreciate this, Kim, but we call it the X Factor, mental wellness and resiliency for first responders. And that class was stemmed out of a 90-minute course that I created for San Antonio Police Department for our in-service training. That 190-minute block, I was able to get 23 police officers for the first time in their lives plugged into therapy, coaching, inpatient, outpatient, some form of services that some of them had 30 years in the job and they never would have considered doing it, but for that one course. So Jesse and I are like, we've got to expand this. And so we've turned it into a 2-day course. And that's gone incredibly well as well. I mean, it's saving lives. Truly. The officers are telling us, tears in their eyes. I had a plan, I had means to take my life, and you guys have changed my mind. I want to fight. I want to keep fighting. And that's why we do what we do. And my big, hairy, audacious goal to end with this is, I want to see in my lifetime, whenever that's going to end, I want to see at least 1 year where we don't have one first responder suicide. That's my goal. And I want to be a part of it in every platform I get, which is why I appreciate you, Kim, just because the reach, you never know who's listening, that's what we're set out to do. I mean, we want to create individually well people, humans. Hurt people. Well, we want to help people. And we want to grow our community of like-minded individuals that just fully buy into our, ideas and concepts and just know that, like, the universal language in all places on this earth is love. And if we can just pour that as combat veteran Marine cop men who can stand up in front of groups and say, we're diagnosed with a mental illness. We've struggled with suicidal ideations. We've made terrible choices in our lives, and we're still trying every day. And you can too. And then here's some actual tangible takeaways and skill sets. It's just, we're so blessed to get to do what we love and to get to do it together. I'm incredibly fortunate to get to be on this journey with my best friend of 21 years and just go around and meet people where they are and just love on them and just keep getting to do it. We're so fortunate. So thank you, Kim. I appreciate it.
Wow, Joe, what a great story. Thank you. And yeah, hurt people, and to turn that around to help people, helping people help people. And to have 0 suicides, I think, is an incredible goal. I support you in that. And I hope that everything we do out of Rethink You is going to support that journey. Because like you, it's been interesting to me that Les Brown was the one who told me to step out and tell my story, which I did. And as you said, being a suicide survivor myself, or a failure at suicide, I've joined this community of people who've come out the other side to thrive. So you're pushing all my passion buttons. And I recognize that telling my story and helping people through the process of being able to get their lives on track has put me into a completely different track. And like you, I no longer worry about the money. It just flows. I'm like, I'm happy. I'm loving what I'm doing. I'm called to help people live restored lives. And along the journey, I'm meeting people like you. So that's why we're putting together, let me sort of talk briefly about the panel, and then I'm going to have a final word, Joe. I'm putting, for those of you who are regular listeners, I'm creating a panel discussion that we're going to do in June. And it's going to address the issues of mental health in our first responders and our soldiers, and also talk about the fact that not everybody comes out with PTSD. And you also have PTSD in non-combat situations. You have a lot of regular civilians with PTSD. So I'm separating out the topic of trauma and may well address it in a subsequent panel, but we're talking very specifically about this overall behavioral health. And you can see why I'm excited to have Joe and possibly Jesse as well on the panel to bring their lessons and their tools to the table, together with some other experts that you'll get to hear from in the coming weeks. So Joe, thank you again. As I said, I feel as if we could sit here and have another 30-minute discussion, because we always do talk for hours, but this has been an absolute delight. Any final thoughts as we sign off?
I would just, again, I think one thing to remember is that wherever you are, it can change with one simple thought. And like Kim said, while I was a huge advocate for therapy, it's because it was all I knew until I met Kim. And then I was like, oh, I really see it as a 2-part thing, because there's certain traumatic events that people absolutely need therapy for, to learn, I guess, the why and how to process through it. And then coaching is really about how do we then turn the page and get forward so that we can continue in the best path in our lives. So yes, huge advocate for both of those channels. But remember, everything starts with me. And if we all adopt that mantra, it really is, you're one thought away from a different life. And so take care of yourself before you can, because even helpers and protectors, like first responders, military, police, fire, EMS, all of the above, but people, teachers, it doesn't matter. People, we have to be willing to look in the mirror before we can pour ourselves into other people and help them. We've got to be willing to help ourselves first. And so I just wish everyone well. And again, Kim, thank you for having me on your show. I love what you're doing. I love what you stand for. I love that you've turned your really your trauma into triumph, and that you're willing to share it now and put yourself out there. It's why I felt connected with you from the first time we talked. So thank you. And again, with SolutionPoint Plus, that's the website, and I can be found at Joe Smarro on all other channels as well.
On all the social media. Joe, thank you. This has been a delight. And I'm sure, as I said, the listeners are going to be keen to hear from you again, which they will. So that's a wrap for today. Thank you.
Thank you.